Bill and
missing Joe.
Bye.
Steven's here.
Tuesday hits deadline.
Just kidding.
Okay.
No, his daughter. His daughter works. One of his daughters works at Blackbird with him.
Okay, we're ready to start the meeting. This is the City Council Conference meeting of March 12th, 2015. We have one item on the agenda, and that's an update on the Cleveland County Rapid Transit program and the conversations that are going on about the cart.
Sean and I are going to tag team this. As you know, our bus service in Norman is currently operated by OU, the Cleveland Area Rapid Transit System, or CART. It's funded from a variety of sources: the FTA, Federal Transit Administration grant funding, the university, the city, Oklahoma, and Norman Regional Hospital. And we were notified in August that originally that the revenues were insufficient to cover expenses for the current fiscal year. So we addressed that at our October meeting, and this year CART's been managing operations within the budget. But they also told us at that time that they no longer desired to provide city bus service, and that their goal was to transfer bus service to another provider by the end of the current fiscal year. So they have a lot of assets that were funded using FTA grant funds, and they can transfer those to other eligible FTA recipients like the city, COCPA, which is the Transportation Authority in Oklahoma City, or a third-party provider. But the transfer has to be done in coordination with FTA, and plans have to be approved by the FTA. And we need to make sure that there are no gaps in service. So these are the steps. Sean and I have had a number of phone calls and meetings with CART, with FTA representatives, and with ODOT representatives. And these are the steps that they've outlined to us for achieving the transfer. Steps 1 and 2 have already been done. CART sent their notice of intent to transfer service to the FTA in December. The FTA, of course, was closed like most other federal agencies through most of January, but they responded to that notice of intent on February 1st. The next step would be that the new recipient, the city, would ask to be designated as a direct recipient by the state. And then we would ask, once the state does that, we would ask to be formally approved as an eligible recipient of FTA grant funding, and then we would effectuate the transfer of any assets and also the service, bus service upon FTA approval.
Catherine, who decides what all the assets are that have to be transferred? What entity decides that?
OU has identified some assets they would like to keep. And to keep those, it's our understanding they'll have to pay back FTA for the federally funded portion of those assets. All other assets, they've expressed a willingness to transfer to the city for the provision of bus service. And as long as they transfer it to another eligible recipient or provider, then they do not have to pay any federal funds back.
Do we have to agree to whatever they keep?
Not necessarily, but we're going to be going through that process over the next few months, and they've given us sort of a preliminary list of what they've identified as the assets they'd like to keep and the assets they'd like to transfer.
Do we have to accept the assets, or if they give us a whole bunch of broken down stuff, do we have to take it? I mean, it's just stuff. Now I want to get stuff with liability.
No, that'll be part of the transfer plan, is going through all of those assets and determining what is in good enough shape to transfer. And I think they've got all of that identified already.
So if there's any deferred maintenance on either some of the buildings or some of the buses themselves, they have to, I know in public works we talk about bring it up to city standards. You know, as private roads and stuff, bring it up to city standards before you transfer it to us. We're going to kind of use that same standard as, you know, it's not even working order. There's any deferred maintenance on the buildings or transfer stations that they gotta.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the point.
Okay.
Well, for instance, they've OU has told us that they want to keep 12 buses for their campus route. So we're hoping that they're not keeping the 12 best buses and giving us the 25 worst buses.
That's what I would do.
I think they will. I mean,
well,
let's be honest here. How do we stop them from doing that?
That we need to assess all of the buses and determine who keeps what and what value there is to that are kept by either agency. I think one of the more interesting, if I may, Catherine, one of the more interesting conversations we've had, more on the practical side, is this notion that if we're going to get this done by July 1st, and that's coming very fast, the city does not have time to acquire real estate or build a maintenance facility and all of that. But the current Theta Dempsey facility that they built using a large share of federal funds could be leased back to the city or to, and then we would lease it then to the operator. We like that a lot right now from a short-term standpoint. That facility was designed and built for that purpose. It's a beautiful facility, and we certainly couldn't buy real estate and build one by July 1st. So that's one of the things that they would not necessarily have to pay back if they lease it to the next operator.
So Councilmember Clark and then Bierman.
I just wondered how many buses we have total.
There's 37, is that the number?
A little under 40, yeah.
Yeah, a little under 40 buses. They'd like to keep it there.
Councilmember Bierman.
So what did I say? I thought we were looking at end of the year 2019, not calendar year, not the end of the fiscal year.
Fiscal year 2019 has always been the request from the university.
I see that being a difficult goal to accomplish.
We agree. But as Catherine will mention here in a minute, in our most recent conference call with FTA, they would like for us to do that too. So now it's not just the university asking us to do that, now it will be FTA preferring that as a grant recipient. So now the pressure is on.
So we've completed steps 1 and 2, and then I'm going to go through these last steps individually in more detail. So step 3 is that the new recipient, that would be the city, would ask the state to designate us as a direct recipient. Generally speaking, the governor has the power to designate recipients and has delegated that power to the Department of Transportation, except for one strange administrative rule that says for Norman and Lawton, the provider is X. So this rule specifically says the designee for the annual appropriation for Norman is CART. And so that rule likely needs to be changed to allow us to be the designee. I've looked at the state's regular rulemaking process. It can take a few months. You have to get approval by the legislature. We're currently in session through May. And so we would likely be working with the governor's office and ODOT to get the rule passed through the emergency rulemaking process. In that process, you don't have to get legislative approval right away. The rule goes into effect immediately, and then the next session, the legislature could approve it. So that's going to require a lot of coordination with ODOT and with the governor's office. And we've already had some conversations with ODOT about how to move that forward. So once that gets done, then we go to FTA and ask that we be formally approved as an eligible recipient of grant funding. And what they're looking at is, do we have the legal capacity, the technical capacity, and the financial capacity to provide and operate a bus system? Legal capacity is easy. We're authorized under state law to operate a transit system. The technical capacity is going to involve identifying what buses and what facilities we are going to get from OU to provide these services, what capital needs we may have to maintain services in accordance with FTA regulations. And then, of course, a big piece of that is determining who the provider is. The city can be the grant recipient and then contract with someone else to provide this service. We don't have to take on the whole operation ourselves immediately. And then the financial capacity is we'll have to be able to identify available funding for capital and operational needs for operating the system. So along those lines of financial capacity, I just wanted to show this to you, and you all have seen this before. This is the funding that CART has now. They have revenue of a little over $4.5 million. A lot of that comes from the student transit fee. That is not proposed to be given to the city. We're going to use that to operate their on-campus system. The fare box includes a game day shuttle. So if you take about $100,000 off of that, that's what we could probably expect from the fare box. And so that would leave us about $2.7 million to operate the bus system, assuming the city's current contribution of $635,000 remains the same.
So the 2.7 is with our contribution? Oh my.
Looking at it from another point of view, if it costs us $4.5 million to operate the system, and it may or may not, we'll need to make up another 1.8 million to operate the system starting July 1st.
No, no problem.
So this is timely for
One quick
budget
question.
discussion.
Councilmember Bierman.
Just before you move on, the stars on your student transit fee and the fare box game day shuttle.
The student transit fee will be retained by OU, so that's not included in the anticipated revenues for another operator. And then the game day shuttle represents about $100,000 of that $250,000, so we can expect about $150,000 in fare box revenue.
Taylor wanted to make a comment.
I was just gonna say that the 4.5, and I'm speaking from ACOG now, not CART, just so I'm aware, I no longer work at CART. But the 4.5 does include the campus routes that OU plans to.
Right.
The cost. So those costs will be associated with the.
Right.
Do you
So we
know
won't
how
be-
much those, can you subtract those out or approximately, so we'll know where that comes off of the 4.5?
You could, I can't do that off the top of my head, but I'm sure that Chris and or Susan are correct with that for you.
You're
So-
losing money, right? You were losing money previously.
That is what OU.
So I assume the costs are more than the revenue.
Right.
It just depends on how
Councilmember
much those
Scott.
campus routes are costing.
Does this include staff and everything or would that come
This is
from an
just-
outside?
Yeah, this is just the revenue piece. So this is just the money they have to pay for the program, and this is what they use to pay for their staff. At OU, it's blended in somewhat with their parking staff and parking revenues.
Because
This is
that's
what
what
they
they've been
feel
using.
like
Say something.
it takes to run a system. That includes the campus routes and the off-campus routes.
So are we thinking we'll pay for this outside of our capital or general?
Generally, this would generally be a general fund operation.
General fund operation.
You could use capital funds for some of the capital items if you chose to, but this would be another general fund operation.
Councilmember Bierman.
These might be questions for Taylor to answer. I'm not sure. The OU student transit fee, that is the only fee that students pay to ride the bus, correct? So when they just ride the bus, even if it's off campus, they don't pay. I assume that we would not be doing things the same way.
And faculty, like I don't,
And faculty?
faculty staff.
Okay, because I was like, I have lived in 2 other college towns with very significant public transit systems, and while students get a discount on the regular rate, they all pay. Students can't just travel around Washington, D.C. on the metro at no cost. So
Be a change.
I would imagine that that would kind of help us anyway in terms of our operating costs, because everyone who would ride the bus would pay something.
Well, better public transportation, we have to pay for it.
That includes students.
I think people would at this point.
So once we establish our legal, technical, and financial capacity to operate the system, and we're approved as a transit provider, we would work on transferring those assets and the services by July 1. As Sean said, FTA's expressed a strong preference for this as well, because federal funds grant funds will be really difficult to split mid-fiscal year. And so they would like us to have that done July 1st, if at all possible. If the city desires to contract for another provider for bus service, so that we would be the recipient, but then we would have a contract with a provider, we would go through a request for proposal process that could take a couple of months or more. But if we desire to contract with another public entity, like an Embark, that can be done without going through the RFP process. So that can be a time saver for us.
Yes, Councilmember Hickman.
Just out of curiosity, is it possible to effectuate the transfer July 1st, 2019, but then knowing realistically we may not be in a position to take it over, contract back with OU to run it for through the end of the calendar year or for some period of time? Because I mean, I'm just being pragmatic and realistic here. Where are we going to put these buses? Where are we going to put these bodies?
Right.
I mean, regardless if we get all the paperwork done,
I got
which
space.
seems unlikely to me. We just got to be realistic and say, where are we going to put the bodies? How are we going to hire the people? How are we going to get all this stuff done? So obviously, to me, the pragmatic, logical question becomes, can we just contract with OU and say, we've got all this done, but we're going to contract with you to run it for some period of time longer while we finish these details.
Okay, we have a representative from CART. Chris is here.
I had this on my calendar for 5:30, so Taylor
I
texted
did
me
too, Chris.
and I rushed over, so my
Bus
apologies.
was running late.
Bus was totally running late. I used to use that joke a lot. So I actually met with our legal counsel yesterday, and that's one of the issues that we talked about. FTA in the call was adamant that the city needed to be the recipient by July 1st. What we thought might happen is let's say that we operated July and August, and the transfer happens September 1st. What we would like to do is the city's the recipient. We bill the city for X amount of whatever it costs to run the service for July and August. I'm sure our attorneys talk to each other and work that out. But yes, we're amenable to that.
And I know we have a call scheduled next week,
2 weeks.
2 weeks. And I'm sure that'll be part of the discussion. We've developed some next steps, assuming that we have to meet this July 1st deadline. And it's tight. And so having this other option with OU is very attractive. We would first have to coordinate with the governor's office and ODOT to get that rule changed to name Norman as the recipient of those funds. And then while that's happening, we could explore whether Embark would be able to take over the current off-campus bus service. Part of that would be what's the cost going to be to us? What's the cost to the riders? For concerns about whether or not, Embark would increase the rates to ride the bus.
Councilmember Clark.
So with Embark, is that the only one we're looking at right now?
There are really 3 transit providers in this region. One is University of Oklahoma, which will no longer be here, Embark, and then there's a company called McDonald Transit that operates the Edmond system. But that was the point of Catherine's previous note there, that McDonald Transit, this is one of the takeaways we had from our conference call last week, they are a private company.
So the public is the way we'd have to go.
Well, to do a private company, you have to do RFPs and do a much more elaborate selection process.
And Embark's Oklahoma City. Okay. And we've talked to Embark.
Yes.
What has their general response been?
They are, we've talked to both of them, both Embark and McDonald. They're both, I think, sympathetic to our situation. Let's put it that way. First of all, they're watching this process from a distance. They are both willing to help us, but we haven't defined what that means. Embark certainly hasn't said that they are willing to operate as a contractor. Again, the devil's in the details. They're going to need to know what that means.
Because, I ran into Mayor Holt at an event on Saturday and asked him what his thoughts were, and he didn't know that CART was ending. So he hasn't been filled on it yet. But I was like, well, we should talk, because I think we'll be working together a whole lot more closely in the near future. But I'll throw out, with the RTA, we were at that event. It seems more logical now than ever before. There have been thoughts about a Cleveland County combination because Moore doesn't have a bus system. So I want to make sure, as we had the conversations about that possibility.
Honestly, because we're kind of focused on just maybe getting this done by July 1st.
Fair enough. So it could happen eventually, but okay.
I'm being a little more candid than I should maybe, but I think all we can plan to get done is to get the transfer, maybe in the grant, the recipient transfer in place, and the details of a contract provider, whether it be Embark or someone else, by July 1st, and maybe then extend that for a couple months before we get all that worked out.
So it would be possible to do, last question, a temporary contract with Embark just to make sure we keep the service going, but while still exploring other options. We didn't have to be like a 20-year.
We were thinking a shorter term contract so that we would have time to take a breath and figure out what, if we wanted to take on a system ourselves, what that would require of the city in terms of funding, staffing, facilities, and all that.
We should make sure and talk to Embark and see if they're willing to do a short-term contract like that.
Right.
I'd be surprised. But
We had that conversation briefly. Again, the devil's in the details. They need to know what that means. We talked in terms of the 3 to 5 year relationship with the first provider to kind of get our feet on the ground. And I would think it would take a year or two before we could even begin to talk about expanding the system and county correlations and so on and so forth. It's just going to be all we can do to pick up what they currently have and try to operate that with the budget that we will have to work with.
Yeah, Councilmember Wilson.
So in a situation where Embark would take over even for whatever extent of time, would that would there be like shared resources? And I think that kind of goes to that RTA thing. Like now we could go to more like you said, but also my fear of having these giant capital requirement buses, like if one breaks down or something like that, would that be something, I don't understand. I don't know that I fully understand how those systems work. I don't know what they're.
Let's kind of compare it to what they have now. So the University of Oklahoma is
They've offered.
completely inclusive operation today.
Mhm.
The mechanics working on the buses work for the university. The drivers work for the university.
Well, they've
Chris
reached
works
out
for the
to us.
university. They're housed in a university building. The bus stops belong to the university. Everything is university owned. We're talking here about a hybrid system. The city would be the grant recipient. The city would probably own the buses, at least on the outset of the transfer. The city would lease the building from the university and then sublease it to this contractor, Embark. And so what we're talking about here is a very different animal than what we have today and what many of the operations are out there. But it's, I think, the best we can do to get this accomplished in a short time. And it seems silly to go out and buy real estate and build a multi-million-dollar building when there's a building built here for that purpose. So we think that notion of a lease is really good. The university likes that idea as well. FTA likes that idea so far.
Okay.
So we think that's a good start anyway to get us off the ground here in July.
Okay, Councilmember Bierman.
So again, I know that you said we're a little ways down the road from looking at a longer term provider. But one of the things that, in my opinion, is most attractive about Embark is the possibility of connecting routes from Norman up to Oklahoma City, because particularly for those in our community who are disabled and don't have the ability to just hail an Uber, we are not an island. Even though CART access can get them wherever they need to go in Norman, we don't have every single specialist in Oklahoma in Norman. And so getting to Oklahoma City is an extremely complicated challenge for people who do not have the ability to simply, flag down an Uber on their phone. They don't have that ability. And so to me, that's one of the most attractive things about CART is the ability to connect the metro in such a way that if someone lives in Norman but does not have the ability to use traditional transit to get them up to Oklahoma City, that this will be an option for them.
Sure, you bet.
So I really like that. I'd love to kind of keep that in our frame of mind as we're looking at a long-term plan.
Councilmember Clark.
Well, that was one of my questions as well. I wrote down CART access to OKC because I've heard it as well. If CART access, you're staying within the Norman city limits. But I mean, how do we ensure that we have that same CART access option?
And of course that we can get Anthony down here from Oklahoma City every day.
Right. Got work to do.
That already exists. I mean, the Sooner Express operates 6 times a day between Norman and Oklahoma City. It's fully accessible.
That's
And
good.
2 of those 6 are operated by Embark. They're Embark
Okay.
buses.
That's also good.
So someone with a disability could ride CART access to a Sooner Express stop, get on the bus, get off at Oklahoma City, is correct? Right, the Metro Lift or the Embark.
Right, Embark Plus, but they have to schedule another ride with Embark to make sure that was all approved with them as well.
And so we wouldn't have any sort of disruption of that service with what we're currently discussing.
We're really thinking taking over exactly what CART is doing
Okay.
today at the outset.
And then another question, let's say we end up partnering with CART. Would we have the same amount of control over routes that we do now? Like the
mean
whole process
Embark?
of changing it? That's what I meant. Embark.
That would be part of your contract with Embark. We would have that all established before council would approve the contract.
So we wouldn't have to go through the whole, what we went through with CART, where we had to request that they do it. We would have,
We would then be the grant recipient.
We were,
so because we're the recipient, we get to
Correct.
decide.
You're the boss.
Got it. So that was where you guys weren't just holding out on us.
You were the recipient. so
You had
we-
everything had to go through you.
Correct, we held the cards.
Got it.
The difference, if I may, every time you would change something, let's say we add a route or go to more frequent stops, we would have to negotiate that with Embark, pay them more to do that.
Like recycling and expanding.
Sort of same principle. Same principle. Yeah. They're the contractor.
Got it.
So part of the issue is going to be making decisions about how far our money will go in July after we do the transition and then figure out what we're going to do to meet all the wish list things that we have, because my fear is we won't be able to start off doing everything that we want to do, and we're going to have to figure out funding. And right now we know what our capital budget looks like for 2019. And if we're talking about coming out of general fund, we got to figure that out. So, but we have to keep the core services going the best we can. Councilmember Scott.
So would we own all of the buses and lease some of them to OU? No.
Embark, probably.
To Embark,
correct.
okay.
I'm assuming that's our contract.
OU would retain some buses.
They would
for
they're just gonna
campus
hold on to them.
routes.
And again, that may be part of the negotiation with Embark. They obviously own many buses already.
That's another question I had,
That
is
may be
if,
part of the negotiation with them. They may not want to lease our buses. They may want to buy their own. I don't know. Those are the kinds of things we need to work through.
in housing for the buses, would we lease that from OU as well?
Possibly. We would lease the building, at least right now, that's the theory, that we would just continue operating in the heated MC facility for the foreseeable future as a leasee. We would be leasing the building from the University of Oklahoma.
Okay.
Councilmember Hickman.
Where and what steps, if any, I guess, do you see council action being required in this process? I mean, is council action required to ask to be designated as a direct recipient? Is council action required to be, I appreciate the update. I'm just kind of wondering, or is it not until, a package comes to us with the contract of all the assets negotiated and, the plan with OU, is that contract what's brought to council to vote on?
I mean, I think we would want council action to be designated as a recipient. We don't want to step out there and ask for that if that's not what you all want. But at the same time, given the timeline, we need to start that process before we have some of the other details you're requesting, just because that process can take a long time, and we need to be simultaneously working on some of these other steps. So if the providers embark, we've got to be working with them pretty soon about how much is it going to cost to preserve the status quo service for this next year? What does that look like? Where do we put the buses? Kind of getting all of those things finalized. But I think we can have a pretty, decent idea of a lot of that information before we ask certainly for FTA designation. That's what we'll be working on while that rule change is being made.
Because part of what I'm asking is I see on here development of a contract solidifying the revisions of service. I assume that would be the contract with whoever we were going to use next.
Right.
But I don't see anything under that says, or maybe I missed it, that there's going to be a contract negotiated with OU to end our relationship and transfer assets. And I assume that there will be such a thing, but
It's that
is that
the assets to be transferred from OU, that will be in the form of an agreement. It's determining what assets get transferred and how all that ends up working. It will likely include, at least we're hoping, a lease for the facility and maintenance of the buses.
and will there be council action on the agreement with OU?
Yes, absolutely.
But that would follow, I think, FTA authorizing that transfer of assets.
Mhm.
They've got to authorize it because they were purchased with federal funds. We're kind of secondary to the FTA action. But absolutely, council will have to receive that. Ultimately, council would approve the Embark contract, or assuming it's the presumption it's going to be Embark. Let's say it's Embark. That's going to be the big one for council consideration going forward.
Okay, Councilmember Castleberry, then Clark.
I hate to be the financial guy, but how are we going to take on $1.8 million of additional services, whether it's stormwater, any service? I know we want to do this, and well, I don't know that we want to do this. We're told we have to do this, but Embark, I assume whoever we contract with is not going to subsidize us. They're not. It's going to cost us 1.8 million or more. I don't think Embark's going to take on the service and lose money.
Right.
I don't think OU is going to lease us their facilities and lose money.
Keep in mind, we'll be cutting out those on-campus routes and gaining revenue from those riders, which will help make that amount a little bit less. But we will likely be looking at more money to keep the status quo.
I think it's about a $3 million operation if I were projecting as I'm looking at numbers here. I think it's in that ballpark.
So subtracting out OU, you're thinking for us, it'll be about 3 million.
That's a rough estimate that I think is pretty close. Now, what Embark would charge, I don't know, but the way that we've done it, $3 million.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
but Kepler,
that's,
I was gonna say, to the previous question, I think council's biggest role in all of this is gonna be the budget, which has to be happening simultaneously with this other negotiation. We put kind of a placeholder in the FY '20 budget for consideration, but we don't quite know what number to put in there. You're right.
I guess that's my question. I'm not comfortable with that number. It's gone from 300,000 to $1.8 million to 2.7. I mean, I'm going with $1.8 million because I think that's where it's going to be. Anthony, given our current budget situation, throw another $1.8 million in there. How does that affect us?
It would be difficult to absorb. I mean, if it's $1 million or if it's 600,000 or if it's 2.4 million, it would be difficult to absorb. But I mean, decisions would have to be made.
Robert, you're factoring in that there's already 600,000 allocated.
Right.
So.
Well, we already got 600,000, but our total budget's going to be $1.8 million, including 600,000. So I think we got to get our hand. I mean, this is great. I want to do it, but I think if we can't afford to do it, I mean, Anthony's being kind of nice, but you take 1.8 times 3 years. Given our current budget situation, and the city of Norman doesn't have money to do anything. And that's taking consideration ending the TIF, bringing the PSST in, pass the stormwater. I mean, I got to get comfortable that we can afford to do this at all before we start figuring out all the logistics of what the routes are. And I mean,
I agree. And again, it's part of the design of the system that we're going to propose. And it could be that you would have to cut some of the current services that are already there to get it in a budget that the city council can authorize.
yeah, I think the first thing, we have to figure out how we're going to do that first year and maybe the second year. And then there's going to have to be a lot of things that happen. Okay, Councilmember Clark, then Scott.
So are we confident that that's going to be the grant amount? Like, did the FTA confirm that?
The 1.7 million.
Yeah.
We haven't heard otherwise.
It's pretty consistent.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not different from OU to the city. It's just what the community get, a population.
Taylor looked at this pretty hard yesterday from his ACOG seat and sent me an email. And it is formulated based on population density, not so much ridership. So
Once you hit the 200,000 people mark in your urbanized area, then you start getting judged by your vehicle miles or passenger miles.
but below that, it's based on population.
Well,
So it should not change.
I would point out that we need to make sure we're getting public feedback about where we want the routes. I mean, I think we definitely need to be mindful. We might have to shrink them going forward again to get it into a number that we can work with. But we keep talking about wanting to be a walkable and accessible community. So in theory, if we do this correctly, more people will ride it, which produces more revenue. So it won't be in the immediate future. I understand your concerns, and I appreciate you being so practical with all of this. But we also need to be mindful of our vision for Norman and what we want it to become, and think about that. I mean, you may never ride a bus. You didn't come to my Clark on the bus, the read and rides, but we can get there.
I think public transportation is a cultural deal.
Okay.
I think it's a cultural deal depending upon.
I
which
see your
jurisdiction.
hand. I'm
I was
going to
responding
call
to her
on you
direct
next.
question. I apologize.
The rest of us have
Okay.
to raise our hands.
Councilmember Scott.
Thank you. If we have the UMP TIF ended by June 30th, will that make this more easily absorbable? No?
Well, as we've discussed with council, the immediate draw on in the sales tax apportionment is to pay for the PSST. And that kind of gets us to square zero.
But that was before we knew about this last year.
But I'm just, the dollar amount happens to be about the same.
We have
So-
to make some decisions.
So decisions would have to be made.
Councilmember Bierman. Just,
I look at this a little bit differently. I trust Chris when he says that it'll cost about $3 million for us to run a service without campus routes, and looking at the difference between 3 million and 2.785 million, number does not look nearly as scary. So I'm going to err on the side of optimism on this end, because I think Chris knows what he's talking about. And that certainly is a much easier gap to manage than looking at just the overall numbers, which, while obviously these are accurate numbers, they do not reflect what the city will be managing or the cost the city will be incurring, because it includes a lot more than what the city is going to be operating. Plus, we're going to have ridership fees from students that we don't have already. So I guess I just have a slightly different take on it. And, I don't want to scream that the sky is falling until it actually starts to fall. So I think that you guys are going to go and get hopefully the best possible estimate you can from Embark. And then we can fall off that bridge when we get to it.
Just mention, if I may, Mayor, the other thing we've sort of discovered is, and I've observed it for years, frankly, but there will be some staffing implications here. Like Taylor's old job was full-time administrative. There's a lot of administrative duties when you're dealing with a federal agency, and we were just reflecting on the city of Edmond has their bus system. It's operated by a private contractor, McDonald Transit. They have a full-time staff member who is doing nothing but transit administration. Embark is the grant recipient for them. They have full-time people doing grant administration for the Edmond system. So it can be a fairly administrative rich process. And so that's another thing we might have to do.
contracted.
The Edmond contracted with McDonald, but Embark is the grant recipient. Kind of an odd situation.
Well, Chris is one of the assets that's coming with the system, right?
My point is we might
Chris
have
is
to
doing
add some
parking.
staff.
Chris is doing Taylor.
Because Edmond is in the OKC urbanized area. That's why
You,
Embark
big
is
brand on
there.
Steven.
Exactly. My point is, I think we may have to add some staff this year as well. We might add it in-house. You could contract it, maybe with Embark. Again, that's another part of the negotiation with Embark. But someone has to do all that administrative, the duties that are required.
The reporting is very extensive, and with Taylor raising it, that falling to me and another person is very expensive.
Councilmember Clark.
Should we be getting public input at this point about the routes that we want to keep, so we're not scrambling once we get this all worked out? I mean, where does that piece factor in? I want to make sure we're not ignoring that. I don't want to put the cart before the horse. I don't want to get people excited and have these big expectations, but I feel like
Do not make that into a headline.
Putting the cart.
before the horse.
Cart.
I think if we can maintain the status quo
Didn't
for
you
next
realize-
year.
No.
But I saw Mac behind you.
Mac was giggling like, "Oh, thank you for that headline."
I think if we can maintain the status quo for next year, given the July 1st
So
date,
she was status.
with
okay.
the, with a budget amount we can live with, I think that is a total win. But you'll see this last bullet, we didn't know that, we want to have a committee and get that input. And so we're thinking, once the service is transferred, we can start that process so that we can get feedback ahead of your next year's budget process and find out, what additional funding you would need to provide those services.
I think once the transfer happens, you would actually have to follow the FTA public meeting process
Yeah.
before you can make any changes.
Yeah.
I
And we went through that.
Taylor whispered that in my ear. I feel very strongly that you would have to do
Yeah.
that like we just did with the Saturday service changes.
So
Yeah,
that
but-
would be helpful. That
30-day notice and then 30 days before the hearing, and then 30 days before you implement.
Yes, Councilmember Holman.
I was just going to say that I think public transit is a economic generator, And we have people that rely on the current system we have to get to jobs
Equity.
where they make a wage and they go and spend that money on things they need, which generates sales tax in Norman. And I think we need to consider it's not just the cost of providing the service. There's a benefit to the whole community of having it. And, I definitely support doing whatever it takes to make sure that people that rely on the service now can continue to rely on that service while we figure out how to make the service even better, hopefully, going forward. And I definitely like the idea of Embark and being a part of a bigger metropolitan system at some point, as
with the RTA coming along.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and I think we can get this done. So thank you, staff, and all your hard work.
Yeah, I'm on the Embark train too. So, yes.
I just want to request more financial information.
You bet.
I mean, I've got $3 million, I got $300,000. I mean, we got
Yeah.
1 point. I mean,
Appreciate
where
that.
do you see that in the process?
We're ready to drill down. I mean, these are the
Yeah.
points of direction that we were needing tonight. What I'm hearing is that the group favors Embark as opposed to another operator, at least on the outset, so we can begin
We
that
only have 2
negotiation. Well, here, there's others, I'm sure, in the country, but that helps us a lot. That simplifies the selection process for that contractor. It's allowed us to move quickly. We're moving on the governor's request already. Catherine's working on that. So I think once we've selected and begin negotiations with Embark, then they start helping us build that budget. It's sort of an ongoing negotiation as well as with CART. We've got a pretty good sense of what it's costing to operate the system today. So taking those parts out that are no longer related to the university is fairly easy to do. And then, of course, translating that back to what's Embark going to charge for that same service. That's the part we don't know. So we'll have that for you, I think, in the next 30 days, I would hope, as we approach the budget discussions.
Other questions? Okay. We appreciate that. So we'll just be waiting for another report because there's no action for us to take at this time. Yeah, 30 days. 30 days. Yes. There was the last question.
No, I'm meeting even look at food wrong. I might get a stain on this dress. So
I know. I ate very carefully a burrito or a.
It'll come out here in your budget.